Thanks. So we also poll these spaces to find out what would be relevant for these men in these spaces in terms of programming. The last thing we want to do is sort of say, hey, this is a program, and then no one shows up. Next slide. So one of the programs that came out of the barbershop was something called Daddies and Me. And it was a partnership with Kids Up Front Toronto. So what dads were saying was like, listen, coming to a barbershop is great, but I may have my child for once a month or once a week, and that's the weekend, and I tend to get a cut. I don't want to sit in a barbershop all day. We want to do outings. However, the cost, if I have multiple children, going to a Raptors game can be a little bit, it can be expensive. So what Kids Up Front Toronto did, they donated tickets to Black Daddies Club, and we would go as a group. And for someone like myself who had 3 sons, who were much younger at that time, if I had to take one to the washroom, then the other 2 would stay with another person, another dad and their child. And what that does is there's a community building that happens. And as an immigrant to this country, there's a location of community. So one of my sons would be like, hey, I was on the road and I saw Uncle so-and-so, right? And that's from the barbershop or from the Daddies and Me. And there's something about attending as a group, like, so going to the art gallery of Ontario and you see a sea of Black men with their children, you're almost like a part of the exhibit. Folks are sort of like looking like, what's happening over there, right? Next slide, please. So what was happening was that we're going into these communities and hearing these conversations, but there was no research. Again, this is a theme that I've been hearing over the last 2 days. So we collaborated with OISE, U of T, or University of Toronto, and York University. And it was fun, and the City of Toronto for Gathering of Voices, which was the first research project on Black fathers and Black men in Toronto. So the lead researcher was Dr. Carl James from York and Dr. Lance McCready. And one of the approaches that we took was something called the Black Family Value Tour, where we went into each of the NIA or neighborhood improvement areas, or back then it was the priority neighborhoods, and had discussions on topics that we were hearing themes on. The most attended discussion that we had was actually in partnership with Fathers Resources, with Heidi and Danny, who has passed away. And that session was filled. It was only standing room. I remember it was in Lawrence West in Jungle, and it was only standing room. We had Black men, white men, women, men in wheelchairs that were coming to this session. And it speaks about what I'll talk about. Men are looking for spaces to talk. And I've heard men talk about, when they talk about the sofa, there's something about not having enough spaces for us to talk. Next slide. The other thing that came up was a need for us to sort of spend time in green spaces. So the BDC Family Friends Picnic came about, and essentially was a very intentional, intergenerational space. So having grandparents all the way to grandchildren and everyone in between, and having a bunch of activities, folks were speaking, but really it's about being in green spaces and just spending time. And it was a potluck. So all of our events, again, because we're not funded, it's always a question, how do we make this happen? So make it, whether it's a collaboration or we have potlucks for folks to sort of, or think about accessibility. Next slide. So the Breaking Bread series or discussion series was, again, potluck themed conversation that took place, it was monthly, took place across the city. And we used something called conversation cafes. And for folks who may not know what conversation cafes are, it's usually, let's say this whole room came out to a session. We would then break up into small groups based on your intention, what conversations you're interested in. So you're able to go much deeper. And then there was a larger talk back in terms of with the collective. And it was open to all genders. Next slide. So the BDC Summer Hikes is another green space. So research shows that not enough Black folks are engaging in green spaces in Canada for a bunch of different reasons. And again, there's something in terms of going as a group. And again, there's something important around reclaiming spaces or green spaces in the situation as Black folks. And not, so for myself, if I go walking, I can feel a bit intimidating. You'd be like, well, I don't get that. You're 6'1", you don't seem, but there's something if I'm going with my sons, walking in, in a green space, that it feels I'm allowed. However, when I'm walking by myself, I feel like I have to be in protection mode because I feel like I'm a threat or I'm being looked at as a threat. So there's something as, again, going in groups in terms of taking over these spaces that are, again, public spaces, but we don't see folks that look like me for particular reasons. Next slide. So the Black Love on Conference course with York University. York University planning program approached Black Daddies Club and said, hey, we'd like you to teach a course, create a course and teach a course in our planning for graduate planners. And what we landed on was this course. It was 2 years. And what we wanted was for planners, genuinely, as someone who's coming from community into academia, what I noticed was that, especially planners, folks would call it, there's a lot of extraction, I want to call it. So you're going into communities, say you're getting communities feedback, but it's really sort of taking stuff and not really giving back to the community. So this was a co-created course. So for graduate planners, it was sort of like on the syllabus, but we opened it up for community members who identified as Black or African Caribbean, and it was free. And they were able to sort of sit in the course. And the course also, each week we went to different parts of Toronto. We focused on NIA communities. We collaborated with Toronto Community Housing as well as other agencies. So you'll notice that some of the topics for folks in the back, we partnered with Secrets of a Black Boy, the play, and we had a panel. But these two over here, I'm gonna get into a little bit more. The first one is what can the Black community learn about love and resilience from the Black LGBTQ plus communities, and Black Queer Joy, which was a partnership with OCAD University. So again, what this course was also looking at was not just intersectionalities, but the various entry points of Blackness. So when I started Black Daddies Club, very heteronormative standpoint. And then around 2011, there was a shift. There was a shift that started to happen because I met a Black gay man who was a father, and he was like, I'm ostracized in the Black community because of my sexuality, and then I'm ostracized in the gay white community because of my Blackness. I'm like, yo, this guy's in this double-edged sword, and who's supporting him? Next slide. So what came out of that course was something called the Journey to Black Liberation Symposium. And it was a collaboration with Harborfront Center, but it was a collaboration with Toronto, the TQBA, or the Toronto Kiki-Ballis Alliance, and Ultra Red from New York. So it was a very intentional conversation with the Black LGBTQ community, cross borders, and here in Toronto, and a straight organization called Black Daddies Club. And really, we wanted to queer this idea of fatherhood. Because if you think about, if you look at ballroom or the queer community, there's something around intentional families, or there's this thing called houses, where for someone who is navigated, who's been kicked out of their homes, you have these homes, these houses that get formed, and they sort of take care of each other. So, someone will be the house, the mother or the father of the house. And then each of the plenaries, we wanted to sort of engage not just with the head, but like the body, and this unconferencey way of whether it's food or different ways of how Black folks connect. And we also partnered with the Toronto District School Board to have young Black students hold conversations at Harborfront for other students from TDSB. So again, it's sort of like paid forward and sort of supporting them over months to have develop a conversation. Um, Next slide. So folks, if you can't see the back, this is a risky. So this is the Black Liberation Ball. And what this is a category called Sex Siren. So the ball, if you haven't been to a ball before, so you have, as I was mentioning, you have these houses. They come together and they compete. And again, it's something beautiful going to a ball. But again, it's like you have these families that are there competing around various different pieces, like these very different topics or categories. But the idea, and I want to center something here. When I was in New York, there was an elder that mentioned that some of us talk with our heads and some of us talk with our bodies. And there's an importance of like having events like balls a part of like when we do conferences like these, because it allowed different entry points of folks to sort of be represented. Because not everyone, a lot of you guys are PhDs or students, not everyone really is coming to education from this particular place. Next slide, please. So speaking our truth, some of this was in person and then COVID happened. And what we know, like some took place in barbershop sessions and they were open open to different genders. What we noticed is that for the sessions that were men specifics or the men only spaces, there was like, again, it was a lot, men were able to drop deeper, very quicker into the topic. When there is, and it's seen in a barbershop, and if for folks who've never been to a barbershop, there's a lot of machismo. There's a word that comes up, but I've seen it. It's like men could be, like this is in the scenario where it's only men in the barbershop. And men are really talking about some really deep something, getting almost vulnerable. And then a woman comes in, she could be attractive to some, and you see the men straighten up a little bit. And there's a shifting happens in their seat, and then it starts to perform. And the mask comes up. And I think what I'm noticing, there's an intention, there's an importance of having intentional spaces for men to be with other men, as we've heard over the past couple of days. Next slide, please. So when COVID happened, or before COVID, I went through a separation. I was married for 16 years, and that didn't work. And I was like, okay, I'm turning 40, and this is not what where I saw myself. And I wanted to do some healing work. And I heard about this program, this Gestalt program. It's a 5-year program, but the first 2 years I was able to do work on myself. And again, in a lot of academic spaces, when I was doing my master's or even in this space, I'm the only Black guy in my class. So I wanted to create or co-create a virtual space. And I thought it would be for like folks from Toronto will show up. But what I was noticing, this took place the last Sunday of every month. And this is from a very selfish place. I needed a space to connect with other men because like I watch football. So going to watch the game and go with my friends and eating wings, that was an option. I couldn't go to the barbershop. So I was desperate for spaces to connect with other men. But when we had the first one, we had 40 men that showed up. And these men were from the States. We had men from the UK, men from Brazil. And the other thing that we wanted for this space was also for us, we want to make sure there was a wide entry point. So I specifically named that if you were trans, if you were bi, if you had a disability, if you're a mixed race, as long as you identify as a Black man, this space was for you. And I was nervous about that because it was virtual. And I've been Zoom bombed on a couple work stuff, and I didn't want that to happen in this space, but that didn't happen. And there's something beautiful about a Black trans man or a Black gay man talking to a Black straight man, and not to say, yo, we're all the same, because we realize that we're not. There's similarities and there's differences, and there's a beauty in learning from those differences. Next slide. So this year we've put a big emphasis on families just because of what came out of COVID. And this is a collaboration that we're doing with Princess Trust, which is ongoing. It's an employment program, an employment training program for Black and racialized families who face barriers to employment. It was interesting. I was going to say this, but your earlier slide, the first one, there was a young woman that was there that I worked with her. And it was tough watching it because, again, I get it. It's sort of there's a story, there's a perpetrator, but then I worked with this person for 2 years, and she came out of prison, and seeing how there's another part of another story to some of these folks. Next slide. So the Black Families on Conference is something that I've been sort of working on for the past 5 years. And it's coming to fruition next month. And it's a collaboration with Tim Hortons Camp, the Justice Fund, TCAC, or Toronto Community Housing. And it's a 3-day, 2-night camping excursion at a Tim Hortons camp for Black families that are not for free. That folks who can't afford, and again, COVID has impacted what we can say is disposable income. And engaging folks who are not able to spend time in green spaces. And you'll notice a theme around healing and also being intentional about green spaces. Next slide. So going back to the second point around working with media, there's a documentary coming out next month, October 7th, called Boys Will Be Themselves. And it's a collaboration between Backroad and CBC Gem. So this documentary will give a nuanced portrait of what masculinity looks like across Canada. And so again, it's on CBC Gem, so check it out, shameless plug. Next slide. So engagement highlights. So the key takeaways is win-win collaborations, co-create a space for Black men to speak about issues, decreases the isolation that we're going through. I'm just one father, so this work, again, I'm very selfish. I want to say this. This work is as much about for myself as the folks I'm working with. So in this work, I've decolonized my homophobia. I've stretched and redefined what masculinity is. Even going through my separation, it's a new process of healing. So research is me search, where it's redefining my own ideas around what fatherhood means. Where are we going? I'm training to offer therapeutic support. So that's why when Mr. Wright, when he was talking, I was just like all ears, because it's very, to see a Black therapist that's a man, whether it's Halifax or whatever, it's sort of like, it's super necessary, and there's a need for it. And then expanding the education process in the Black communities to think about on conferences and different approaches that allow different Black folks to sort of enter these spaces. And then accessing resources for Black families through collaborations. And next slide. And that's it. If you want to find any more things like the research, everything can be found